Hello again. In this video, we're going to talk about 401ks. Important disclaimer up front. We are not offering investment or tax advice. I'm not an attorney or a CPA. The information you're going to hear is for information purposes only. We're going to start off with a quick introduction to 401ks from the website investopedia.com.
The 401k plan is one of the most widely used retirement vehicles. 401ks are established by employers to help employees realize their retirement goals. It is considered a qualified plan, which means it is eligible for tax benefits. In a 401k plan, you can make contributions from a portion of your employment earnings. These contributions can be made before or after payroll taxes. Once the contributions are in the account, the profits made from investing these funds grow on a tax-deferred basis. This means that if you make pre-tax contributions from your pay, you won't pay taxes on your gains until you withdraw them in retirement. This allows you to reduce your current taxable income and put off those taxes until retirement, when you'll likely be in a lower tax bracket. Some 401k plans, known as Roth 401ks, allow you to make after-tax contributions, so you won't pay tax when you pull the money out after you retire. But you need to hold the money in the plan for a minimum number of years before withdrawing it after retirement. Some employers also match the amount an employee puts into the account, or offer other incentives like profit sharing. This is a great way to boost your savings, but the IRS does set limits on how much you can contribute to these plans, and also sets restrictions on how and when you can withdraw the funds. Because of their tax advantages, 401k plans can help your retirement savings grow much faster than saving and investing without them. If you start contributing early and invest wisely, the 401k will help you leverage time and reduce taxes while achieving your retirement goals.
So in terms of what we're going to cover with the 401k, here's what we'll cover. Give a little bit of history of the 401k. We'll talk about the roles in setting up a 401k. Talk about selecting your 401k provider. We'll talk about annual ongoing costs for running a 401k. We're going to be talking about the IRS contribution limits into the 401k. We're going to talk about matching contributions and what employers need to do or have an option to do. We'll also talk about the differences between a safe harbor 401k and a traditional 401k. We'll also cover 401k loans. We'll talk at some length about non-discrimination testing. We'll talk about 5500 forms. I'm going to talk about the potential need for independent audits. We'll talk about potential liability pitfalls to an employer in offering a 401k. We'll talk about the requirements for employee education. And we'll talk a little bit about how the IRS views the appropriate process for correcting errors. Regarding the birth of the 401k, it was back in 1978 that Congress decided to make it possible for stock options and bonuses to potentially qualify for tax deferral treatment. Technically, Section 401k of the Internal Revenue Code was born then. But it was an enterprising benefits consultant named Ted Benna who proposed to allow employees to reduce their salaries in order to give the employer the funds needed to create deferred bonuses. It was in 1981 that the IRS finally confirmed the full legality of this type of arrangement, and the modern 401k was born. Now, any employer that's creating a 401k has to be aware that they're going to be dealing extensively with IRS and Department of Labor rules and regulations. So the employer is considered the plan sponsor in all cases, and therefore has the ultimate legal liability for everything that goes on in the 401k. They will most likely hire a plan administrator to help them with that process, an organization that is specifically built to be able to handle a lot of the responsibilities of running a 401k plan. But usually there's also an independent investment advisor that helps approve the types of investments that are allowed in the program and helps provide advice as to which investments might be the best suited for the employer and the employee's needs. There's typically also a CPA who performs some auditing functions, also fills out the annual 5500 report for the Department of Labor and IRS. There's typically also an ERISA attorney involved, helping draft plan documents and keeping the plan up to speed when there's changes, and giving legal advice to the employer whenever there are issues that come up that require an employer to make some judgment about how to operate the plan. There's also, on a day-to-day basis, the involvement of the payroll manager. Because employees and employers contribute to the program, there are times of the year when the employees will be making changes to their elective deferrals, and making sure the payroll manager is on top of those deductions and making whatever changes are necessary in the 401k as appropriate for the employee's decisions. Then we also recommend that employers hire an independent reviewer, somebody outside of this circle of advisors, to once every 3 to 5 years provide a complete overview and double check on whether or not any of the team of investment advisors or the CPA or the ERISA attorney or the plan administrator are out of line with what the IRS would consider to be best practices. In terms of picking a plan administrator for a program, there are some resources out there. This happens to be a press release that J.D. Power releases once a year and evaluates the approval ratings of a lot of the companies that specialize in providing 401k plan administration. In terms of the large employer satisfaction index, this would be employers with 1,000 or more employees. Typically, there's a lot of different players here that are in the marketplace. This chart is showing that Charles Schwab happens to rank in 2019 as the best overall. In terms of the medium plans, this would be anything from 100 to 1,000 employees. Bank of America and Fidelity and Nationwide and Vanguard are in the top rankings. And in terms of small plans, plans under 100 employees, Fidelity Investments, Nationwide, John Hancock, MassMutual, all are in the higher rankings. There are 5 key elements for an employer to consider when creating a 401k plan. Obviously, there are plan costs that need to be taken into consideration, but also the level of administrative work inside the organization in terms of the HR department and the payroll department. There's also compliance responsibilities with the federal government. There's also the employee experience in terms of making sure that this is something that is understood and perceived as an advantage to your employees, and taking the responsibility of handling the investment selection. In terms of understanding how the costs of the 401k are structured, it's important to understand that they can be complicated and are highly variable. The range of costs are due to the amount of contributions, in other words, the assets under management. Obviously, a brand new plan is going to have 0 current assets under management. Also, the number of employees. Both of those factors can play a significant element in altering the nature and overall cost of the various fees that are structured into your program. Keep in mind that the fees that are billed by 401k administrators and other support professionals often are structured in ways that sometimes apply to the employer and sometimes are built into the costs that employees have under the 401k plan. As a short list, really, of some of the categories you'll see, there are going to be advisory fees, there will be plan document fees, administration fees, record keeping fees, custodial fees, asset management fees, employee education fees, distribution fees, auditing fees, discrimination testing fees, government reporting fees. All of these fees can certainly add up to a significant amount of money. Not every 401k administrator will charge all of these fees. Many of them can be bundled. Typical costs, though, for an employer in starting up a brand new plan, you're going to be looking at probably $3,000 to $5,000 at a minimum just to start the program. And then on an ongoing basis, the cost of the plan can typically be from about half of 1% to about 2% of plan assets, subject to usually some floor costs on brand new plans. So if you don't have enough assets in the plan to meet the minimums, then the floor costs would apply, and that can certainly be a few $1,000s each year. Ultimately, employers are going to need to get familiar with the IRS website, and that's what we'll spend the next few minutes doing. You can go to Google and type in IRS 401k, and you'll be taken to really a large collection of supportive material written in a fairly straightforward manner about what you need to know about 401ks. The IRS has put together a resource guide for both plan sponsors, this would be employers, with various topics, as well as information for plan participants. But let's go through some of the topics on the IRS 401k page. In terms of an overview of the types of 401k plans that you may want to know about. Obviously, we've talked a little bit about the tax advantages of the programs. There are different types of 401ks available. There's the traditional 401ks, there's safe harbor 401ks, there's simple 401k plans. The differences between these are that the traditional 401k will expose the employer to these actual contribution percentage tests and the actual deferral percentage tests. In other words, the traditional 401k will come pretty heavy on the side of making sure that the contributions between what the IRS considers to be the highly compensated employees and key employees are not out of balance with the rank and file employees. And the way they do that is with those deferral percentage tests. We'll get more into that in a little bit. So with a 401k, traditional 401k, there are no contribution requirements, but there is that balance in the IRS's eyes of making sure the plan is fair and non-discriminatory by subjecting the plans to those actual deferral percentage tests. The safe harbor plans, as an alternative, are going to be plans where you don't have to worry about the average deferral percentage tests. But the trade-off is that the IRS is going to require the employer to make contributions to employees in a safe harbor plan. And those contributions must be 100% vested. So once given to the employees, if they quit, take that money with them. In terms of simple 401k plans, it was created for small businesses of less than 100 employees. In terms of automatic enrollment in 401k, 401k enrollment is generally an opt-in process. In other words, employees make a decision once the employer announces the plan. The employee gets to decide how much of their pay they want to contribute to the 401k. But with an automatic enrollment program, the default is that the employee is assumed to want to participate in the plan, and they can opt out of the plan. So they don't have to take an active step of opting in. There will be an automatic assumption of a certain amount of pay going into the 401k whenever you have an automatic enrollment process. Generally, employers use elective deferrals, and there are limits, though, on how much contributions can be made into a 401k. In terms of the dollar amount of those, it's generally $1,950 in 2020 as the overall ceiling for contributions from both the employee's contribution and employer's contribution combined. Now, there are lower limits if you're doing that simple 401k plan. In that situation, that elective deferral limit is only $13,500 this year. Now, in terms of catch-up provisions, there's another feature the IRS allows for people who are age 50 or over. By the end of the calendar year, they can put in addition to their regular contribution, they can add another $6,500 in 2020. If you're talking about the simple 401k plan, that dollar amount is $3,000 in 2020. Now, these amounts do go up each year. As you can see, it was $6,000 in 2019, and the cost of living adjustments, in essence, bump that amount up generally in some round fashion. Over the last couple of years, it's been about $500. Let's turn back to the main IRS webpage for 401ks, and let's take a look at the operating a 401k sub-page. On this page, there are a number of topics: participation, contributions, vesting, non-discrimination, and we'll walk through all of these topics. In terms of participation, an employer has the ability to determine which employees are eligible for the plan. Typically, they can exclude employees who have not yet attained age 21, and they can also exclude workers who have not yet met at least 1 year of full-time employment for the company. And, the IRS also allows the employer the option to offer 401k benefits to collectively bargained employees or not, because typically a collectively bargained or union employee has a good faith relationship with the employer in terms of the collective bargaining agreement and might come under some other retirement plan and therefore may be excludable under the employer's 401k plan that's designed for non-union employees. Now, again, in terms of contributions to the plan, employers have a lot of latitude. In the traditional plan, there's actually no requirement that the employer contributes anything to the plan. But again, as we've talked about, the downside of a traditional plan is that there will be non-discrimination testing applicable to it, which we'll get into a little bit more detail in a few minutes. If the employer is interested in making contributions, they can simplify their life significantly by considering a safe harbor plan. In this situation, the employer is committing to a certain level of employee contribution. Typically, it's dollar for dollar matches up to the first 3% of compensation, and then there's an additional 50-cent contribution by the employer for the employee's contributions that exceed 3%, but doesn't have to go above a 5% match. In other words, for that, if an employee is putting in 3%, the employer would be matching the first 3% at 100%. If they put in 4%, that extra 1% the employee is putting in would only get matched at 50 cents on the dollar. Likewise, up to the next level, if the employee puts in 5%, the employer would only put in an extra 0.5%. Anything more than 5% of an employee contribution would not need to be matched any more by the employer. The employer is certainly encouraged to match as much as they want beyond those limits, but those are the minimum thresholds. In terms of an automatic 401k, automatic enrollment 401k, the situation there is where the employee is basically told that under this company's approach, the employee is assumed to want to participate in the plan. The way the rules work, the plan would have to have at least a 3% compensation as a de facto assumption to the employee. Again, the employee can opt out of that contribution, but unless they opt out, 3% of their wages would be deducted from the plan. In terms of how much the employer would have to match on those contributions, the employer can do either a non-elective 3% across the board for all employees, or what most employers do is a matching contribution which is 100% of the salary deferral that the employee ends up on for the first 1% of compensation, and a 50-cent match for any amounts above 1% that the employee wants to put aside. In terms of the simple 401k, how that works, somewhat similar to the Safe Harbor program. It's a dollar for dollar matching contribution up to the first 3% of pay, or the employer could, under a simple 401k plan, make a non-elective contribution of 2% for each eligible employee. Again, there are overall compensation limits and maximums for participating that need to be kept in mind. In terms of vesting, vesting has to do with when the employer's contribution becomes the employee's to take with them if the employee leaves the company. We're going to get more into that in just a second. When it comes to vesting, employers need to be able to allow the employee ownership, if you will, when it comes to the amount that the employer uses as matching contributions. But that ownership doesn't have to happen immediately. So a vesting has to do with at what point in time does the employer's matching contributions actually become, in essence, owned by the employee, so that if the employee leaves the company, they're able to take all of those employer contributions to the plan. As a reminder, the employee contributions to a 401k are always 100% vested. We're only talking now about the employer's contribution. At what point in the future does an employer's matching contributions become vested to the employee? So in this chart here, you'll see the employer contributions for 401k plans can have two different types of vesting schedules. An employer can simply say, after 1 or 2 years of service with the company, any employer matching money does not become vested. But after year 3 with the company, it has to be what's called cliff vested. In other words, after year 3, it's 100% vested. Now, the graded vested is an allowance that modifies that somewhat. Under a graded vesting schedule, the employer could allow no vesting for year 1, but would have to offer at least 20% vesting after year 2, 40% vesting after year 3, 60% vesting after year 4, 80% after year 5, and then ultimately after 6 years of service, 100% vesting of all employer contributions. Let's talk for a few minutes about one of the features of a 401k that you don't find with all retirement plans. That is the loan feature and hardship withdrawals. What needs to be stated off the top, though, is that the employer, when they design the plan, has the ability to determine whether or not the plan document will allow for hardship withdrawals and loans. Most 401k plans are designed to include those features, but not all. Assuming that the 401k that you're in is going to offer those features, it's important to understand how they might work. In terms of the loans, you have an ability to take out 50% of your loan balance up to a maximum of $50,000, at least under the typical plan design. Now, because of the coronavirus, President Trump has signed into law an expansion of that up to $100,000 is now available, but still a 50% of your loan balance is eligible to be taken out and still be in accordance with IRS rules. One of the other things to keep in mind with the 401k loans is it's really not the typical kind of loan. When you generally borrow money in a normal fashion, you're borrowing from a bank or some other kind of financial institution, and you're expected to pay that back with interest. And the interest goes to the people you borrow the money from, the bank. In a 401k, when you pay interest on your loan, you're actually paying yourself back because that money is going back into your 401k account. Now, that's not to say that it's the a cost-free element of borrowing, because the money that you took out from your 401k isn't allowed, just because it's now been segregated into a loan, it is no longer earning any interest from whatever stock or bond investments that you might have otherwise purchased as part of your 401k investment solutions. Also, when you pay your loan back, you are paying it back with after-tax dollars, and the money that stays in the 401k without a loan is before-tax dollars. So you are paying after-tax money to repay your loan, and when you actually ultimately liquidate your 401k in retirement, you'll be paying tax on it again. So some people criticize 401k loans for having this double taxation feature. But when you look at the cost advantages as opposed to somebody who needs money in a short-term manner, maybe for a car repair or medical bills, etc., the alternative of taking a high-interest personal line of credit loan from your bank or running up your credit cards really add a lot of financial cost to those transactions, which a 401k would avoid. So for many employees, if you've got access to being able to borrow money from your 401k account, it makes a lot of sense. There are 401k administrators that even simplify this process even more, allowing employees to have access to loan provisions and potentially even a debit card as part of their 401k processing features with services that they access online. So it might not even be something that the HR department or the payroll department of the company has to get directly involved with. Turning now to our attention to hardship withdrawals. These are funds that are coming out of your account for the 401k that you don't have to repay. But in order to qualify for a hardship withdrawal, there have to be a number of features that would be in place. In other words, there would have to be high medical expenses, generally over 7.5% of your adjusted gross income. It could also be a hardship withdrawal for the purpose of buying a principal residence. You could use the hardship withdrawal provisions also for tuition and related education costs. You could also use it to prevent eviction or foreclosure arrangement on your own home, and even for burial or funeral expenses for somebody's deceased parents as well as their immediate family. Now, when you're doing a hardship withdrawal, the employer does have requirements for creating some documentation to back that up. The amount you can take out during a hardship withdrawal has to be consistent with the hardship paperwork that you're telling your employer you need this money for. And if for some reason the hardship withdrawal was not processed in the right way, you could be subject to not only ordinary income tax, but an additional 10% penalty if you're less than 59.5. The next topic we're going to talk about is non-discrimination testing. It's important to keep in mind that this topic only really applies to employers that have a traditional 401k plan. Employers that elect to go in the direction of a safe harbor 401k or are small enough to have under 100 employees and therefore qualify for potentially the simple 401k direction, those employers are already signing up for employer contributions on behalf of employees and therefore don't have to deal with these non-discrimination tests. There are 3 basic tests that are involved. 2 of them have to do with how much money is set aside each year. The actual deferral percentage test, which looks at employee contributions to the plan, and the actual contribution test, which looks at employee contributions plus the employer matching contributions. And then there's also the top-heavy test, which instead of looking at employee contributions, looks at total account value. With the top-heavy test, you're basically considered to be, by the IRS, a top-heavy plan if you've got more than 60% of the total value of your program in the hands of key employees. Now, to understand how these tests work, there are some other definitions that need to be understood. The first definition has to do with what is a highly compensated employee. That is anybody who is a 5% owner or is a family relationship to a 5% owner, and anybody also who makes $130,000 or more per year. Now, if you have a situation where the employer has a very high wage base, let's say they're all engineers and everybody makes $130,000 or more, you don't have to consider everybody to be a highly compensated employee. The employer has the elected option to take a look at ranking all incomes in the company and defining the top 20% of incomes as the highly compensated group. A non-highly compensated employee is anybody who doesn't fall into the category of a highly compensated employee. And defining employees as highly compensated or non-highly compensated is how the tests number 1 and number 2 are calculated, and we'll go into that in a moment. A key employee is the definition that is used by test number 3, the top-heavy plan rules. And a key employee situation is any officer with $180,000 of annual income, plus any 5% owners, regardless of how much they make, plus anybody who's related to those 5% owners, as we'll define in a moment, plus any 1% owner who makes $150,000 or more. Those are the 3 classifications of employees that fall into the definition of key employees. In terms of this relation issue, the IRS considers what they consider family attribution rules. So anybody who is a spouse of a 5% owner, or a child of a 5% owner, or a parent of a 5% owner, or a grandparent of a 5% owner are considered to be related enough to also fall into the same category. But this family relation rule does not apply when it's a brother or sister situation, or it's an in-law situation, or with grandchildren being automatically considered to be key employees. Now, the way the tests number 1 and number 2 operate is the IRS considers plans to be discriminatory if the highly compensated employees are getting more than the non-highly compensated employees beyond a certain level of wiggle room, if you will call it. So when the plan has very low contributions for non-highly compensated employees, for example, if on average non-highly compensated employees have only 1% of contributions to the plan, then in that range, the highly compensated employees for this group for this year are limited to 2 times that 1%, or in other words, 2% is the overall average that the highly compensated employees would get to put away for the plan. As the non-highly compensated employees' contributions go up, the range of differential widens a little bit. For most levels, it's going to be a 2% differential. In other words, if the non-highly compensated employees put away 4% on average, then 4% plus 2% becomes a 6% total that the highly compensated employees can put into the plan without the plan being considered discriminatory. For very high percentages, once you get, like, for example, 10% is the lower group's average, then the upper group can put in 10% plus an extra 25% level. In other words, a 12.5% overall threshold on average for the highly compensated group once you get into the higher levels of contribution. The rules for what to do if your plans fail these tests, basically it becomes pretty expensive and complicated. If you're talking about test number 1 and number 2 and you catch it early enough before the end of the plan year, then you can force employees in the highly compensated group to reclassify their contributions, in essence, give them money back out of the plan before the end of the plan year, so that their net amount of contributions during the plan year becomes small enough to qualify to become within the range that's necessary. But that certainly pisses off some of your highly compensated employees who thought they were going to be able to get a $15,000 contribution to their plan has been scaled back to only $7,000 because the need to bring highly compensated contributions in alignment with these discrimination tests. If you don't catch it early enough and the plan year is ended, the employer may be in a situation of having to make a qualified non-elective contribution to employees, and this can be a significant amount of money that they would have to put into the accounts of all the non-highly compensated employees in order to get these percentages in alignment. In terms of the top-heavy test, the employer is also in a bind if the amount of money that goes into the plan and it stays in the plan, the accumulated values for your key employees goes over that 60% threshold, and you find yourself with a top-heavy label by the IRS. The solution to that is to make non-elective contributions to your non-highly compensated employees to the tune of 3% of their compensation. So again, that can be a very expensive solution when you find yourself in a situation like this. Now, again, the way to get away from these non-discrimination tests is to design your plan along those safe harbor rules. The next topic we're going to talk about is the Form 5500. It's important to keep in mind that all 401k plans must file an annual 5500 report. In fact, that information becomes part of the public record, and if you're interested, you can download any employer's 5500 from past years off of the DOL website. For small employers, very small employers, so-called solo 401k plans, there is an easy form, a 5500 EZ, for sole proprietors and spouses as long as the plan assets are $250,000 or less. For employers that have less than 100 employees, there's also a somewhat simpler form, the 5500-SF. But most employers are going to be required to file the normal 5500 report. Now, if you actually have just barely over 100 employees, and this is the first year you've had a little bit more than 100 employees, as long as you don't go over 120 employees, you are eligible to use the same form that you used last year when filing your 5500. So it gives a little bit of wiggle room there. But for most employers, the full 5500 is going to be necessary, and that means determinations as to whether or not Schedule A and C and D and G and H and R might be required. And most importantly, employers with over 100 employees in their 401k do have a requirement of getting an independent audit of their 401k each and every year. This is an expensive process. You need to find a CPA who does these types of audits, and from my checking around, the minimum cost is usually in the $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 range, and can easily, depending on the size of your plan and the nature of your investments, go up into the low 5-digit range, over $10,000. The 5500 must be done, it must be filed with the DOL electronically each year with their special system called their eFast system. And the due date for filing a 5500 is typically the last day of the 7th month following the close of your 401k's plan year. For a plan year that runs on the calendar of January 1 through December 31st, that means that the 5500 is due on July 31st for most employers. Extensions are easily available for an extra 2.5 months as long as the proper form 5558 is filed with the Department of Labor in a timely manner. In other words, by your normal due date. There are IRS penalties for late filing or non-filing of a 5500. In fact, the IRS penalty is relatively reasonable at $25 a day, and that's capped at $15,000. But there actually is a separate DOL penalty that can be levied up to $1,100 a day, and there is no cap on the DOL penalty. So most employers who find themselves in a situation of having forgotten to file a 5500 take advantage of what the DOL offers in terms of a way of remedying the situation, and that is their delinquent filer voluntary compliance program. Through that program, a late 5500 the penalty is capped at a simple $2,000 per year, $4,000 per plan. So you may have forgotten to file your 5500 for 5 years in a row. By doing the delinquent filer program, you're able to cap your penalty at $4,000. But the delinquent filer compliance program is dependent upon you self-reporting to the DOL that you made this error. If they catch you, you could be subject to much, much higher penalties. It's important also Keep in mind that the 5500 will have some information that needs to be transferred to a form that needs to be sent to every participant each year. It's called the Summary Annual Report. The Summary Annual Report is due to all participants by the end of the 9th month after the close of your plan year. More information about the Summary Annual Report is available in our video number 6 on ERISA guidelines and other federal regulations. Next, we're going to talk about some of the liability pitfalls of having a 401k plan. One writer on the topic suggested that it's very similar to owning a home. Many people are very happy to open the door to their brand new residence, first-time home buyers, but they don't typically understand all of the legal implications that come with that new home residence, such as what happens if somebody trips and falls on their property and breaks a leg, the fact that they could be sued for having somebody over on a weekend barbecue and they get hurt on their property is something that most homeowners are only vaguely aware of until it hits them. And for that purpose, we're going to investigate a little bit more detail what happens with 401ks and what the responsibilities are for an employer in operating a 401k. In terms of the basics, there are some plan documentation and functional elements of running a 401k that are absolutely essential. Making sure that each employee has a summary plan description of how the plan operates. Making sure they get at least a quarterly statement about how their investments are performing. The Summary Annual Report is something that is requirement to be distributed to each plan participant also annually. The enrollment procedures need to be followed, making sure that you don't miss anybody who becomes newly eligible under your program. Missing enrollments could mean missed contributions to the plan, and missed contributions could mean investment losses that could have been achieved had the person been allowed to participate in a timely manner, and that can be something that the IRS gets involved with, and plan corrections may be necessary if you mishandle employee enrollments. Once somebody is enrolled in the plan, making sure that their weekly or bi-weekly, whatever your payroll function is, making sure their contributions get invested into the 401k out of payroll and into the appropriate investments is essential. At the outset, the IRS and Department of Labor consider about 2 weeks, 15 days to be kind of the longest that an employer should be going without making sure that the investments are placed. But in many circumstances, the IRS and DOL will consider much less time frame. In fact, their rules require that it's the least amount of time possible for an employer to make sure those investments are made appropriately. So don't get complacent in thinking that, oh, I've got 2 weeks to make these investments. The employer should always be trying to move any money that's deducted from employees' paychecks and the appropriate matching contributions from the employer's funds and into the retirement plan itself as soon as possible. Employers need to be conducting periodic reviews, probably at least on a quarterly basis, to make sure their 401k is operating according to the written documents and according to the intentions. If there is any lawsuits, excellent record keeping will be an absolute essential element of any successful defense of the employer from a lawsuit. And we think it's important for an employer to solicit feedback from their employees. From their perspective, are things going as smoothly as the employer thinks they are? In terms of understanding the overall liability, keep in mind that an employer is considered a fiduciary of the plan. In other words, they must always operate this program with the best interests of the participants in mind. There are also some technical definitions of who's a fiduciary found in ERISA. In terms of administration, there's a term called a Section 316 fiduciary. That's somebody who's ultimately responsible for the plan administration functions. And there's also 2 types of investment fiduciaries. A 321 investment advisor is somebody who usually advises the 401k plan sponsor on what investments are appropriate. And there is the 338 investment advisor. This is somebody who actually takes the full legal responsibility of making sure investments are appropriate for participating employees. We'll have more information on fiduciary rules in a separate video on ERISA. Employers should be mindful of the type of 401k they've created. Have they created a trustee managed investment program for their 401k where there's only a limited number of selected investments employees can participate in? Or is a self-directed 401k program, participant-directed 401k program, where each participant is able to select which investments are appropriate for them? That second type does carry some potential liability protection under ERISA. Section 404C indicates that self-directed 401k plans can provide an added layer of protection from the potential for employees to sue the employer for mismanagement or potential losses under their investment in their 401k. It's usually a good recommendation for 401k plan sponsors to ask independent financial advisors to help them develop an investment plan statement, an IPS. A well-crafted IPS can help an employer manage what kind of investments are appropriate on an ongoing basis for the program. One note of caution is if you have written an IPS but don't follow it, you can get yourself in more legal trouble than you would have had if you didn't bother to write one to begin with. It's also important to, when we're talking about legal liability, to understand two types of insurance that can be provided to a 401k plan sponsor. There is the ERISA bond, also known as a fidelity bond. This protects the plan and the plan's participants from potential losses to the plan by mismanagement or malfeasance of an employee of the employer in making plan contributions or taking money that was supposed to be directed to the 401k and absconding with that information, that funding. So that's what a fidelity bond does. There's also fiduciary insurance, which is a completely different type of insurance. This protects not the plan, but the fiduciaries themselves, the plan sponsor, the employer, to make sure that if there is a lawsuit about the management of the program, that insurance can swing into action and help pay for the legal bills of defending the fiduciaries of the program. In terms of the types of lawsuits that are involved, this gets a little messy because the DOL and to some degree the IRS aren't very elaborate in terms of what is required of plan fiduciaries. It's a pretty open-ended framework that they have, and they like it that way because if they think a particular set of facts and circumstances require their attention, they're able to dive into that and in essence regulate by enforcement rather than regulate by clear-cut instructions. It's important to keep in mind that times of financial stress, such as the COVID crisis we're currently going through, can put investments under tremendous strain. And it's at that time in particular that employees may be looking for a scapegoat on their investment losses and may be more subject to lodging complaints and potentially suing a plan sponsor with how a 401k is managed. Keep in mind that plan sponsors are always required to operate their plan for the sole benefit of the workers, the employees who are participants. Any kind of self-dealing on the part of the employee or employer rather is going to be looked at very harshly by regulators. Also, it's important to keep in mind these three areas that seem to be the source of a lot of the lawsuits against 401k plan sponsors. And that's whether or not there are excessive fees being charged, or if the fees are reasonable but aren't really even being adequately communicated to employees. If employees didn't realize that some of their investments have asset management fees or expense loads, etc. So making sure there's transparency on fees is critical. It's also important that investments are appropriate for the employees, and inappropriate investments can be a target for these lawsuits. Also, any kind of employer self-dealing with how they manage their 401k, who they allow into the plan, etc., can certainly give rise to potential lawsuits. In general, what the courts are looking to when they adjudicate these lawsuits is whether or not their employer had a prudent decision-making process in place. They aren't going to be nearly as concerned with whether the fund that was part of the investments actually gained a lot of interest and appreciation or lost money, but whether or not the employer who is in charge of selecting those investments in the first place had a prudent decision process in place for making those recommendations. And to avoid such litigations, there are ways of designing your 401k plan with certain types of design parameters and what types of investments you allow into the plan that can give you a little bit more protection than having a completely wide open approach to what types of investments would be eligible for somebody in a self-directed account. This next portion, we're going to talk about employee education. Again, it's vitally important if the employer is going to have a self-directed type of a 401k program where employees themselves get to direct their investments, that they take this element of employee education very seriously. It is a critical part to be able to defend yourself if you're looking for that 404c protection under ERISA for the employer. In terms of education, it's important that employees understand all of the eligibility provisions of the program. Very important that they understand the employer's match and how that works. Again, the vesting schedule, when do they get to take the money if they leave the company, is an important part of the education process. Also details such as the loans and hardship withdrawals and what happens if there's early distributions or how a rollover would work if they left the company. But most importantly, making sure employees understand the fee structure of how your 401k works is critical, and making sure they have a working knowledge of how any website support tools, if they're going to be directed to handle their own investments, making sure they know how to do that with the tools your third-party administrator has provided is a critical part of the education. It's important also to inject a word of caution here that employees need to be explained that this education is not investment advice. As an employer, as a plan sponsor, as a fiduciary to the plan, you do not want to be giving your employees who are charged with self-directing their own investments to be in charge of handling their investments. You don't want to be recommending particular funds. You want to be educating the employees so that they themselves can make the decision. It's important that your education stays education and not encouragement on a particular path with how they handle their investments. The education process should include an overview of financial wellness and appropriateness of certain investments, including the 401k. It's not a guarantee that every employee who is eligible should be a participant in the 401k. What are the employee's other options with an IRA or a Roth IRA or potentially a spouse's plan? A common situation might be that a particular 401k plan doesn't offer a match, so that employee might be better off not participating in their own company's 401k, but instead enrolling heavily into their spouse's 401k because that spouse might be entitled to a very rich match. So those kinds of basics about what the employee's situation is should be taken into consideration in your employee education. But overall, employees need to be encouraged to save for the long term, save for their retirement, and helping educate employees to the vitalness, even at young ages, to save on a long-term basis is an important part of the education. In understanding and have tools to help explain and explore an individual's risk profile. In other words, how much risk are they willing to take to get how much potential reward. And certain investments have different types of potential risks involved, and the employee needs to understand their own comfort level with risk before being exposed to all of the various types of investments that are possible in your 401k. In terms of the specifics of your investments, this is up to you and your third-party administrator and your investment advisor to decide which options are available. But typical options are stocks. Potentially the entire stock market may be something that you allow your employees to invest in. Also bonds, mutual funds, electronically traded funds, ETFs. These are popular because they typically have very low expense loads and therefore can also add a layer of protection potentially to an employer from being accused of having a 401k with high expense loads. There's also guaranteed investment contracts. Many insurance companies that offer third-party administration services to 401k plan sponsors come with contracts where they will guarantee a certain amount of return on your money, kind of like a certificate of deposit, a CD in a bank. There's also these guaranteed investment contracts that are available through insurance company programs. The investments in potentially money market funds, where there's very little appreciation, but there is safety of principal. There's time horizon funds that are specifically designed to help individuals who may be 20 years away from retirement with a planning and risk profile that's appropriate for that type of time horizon. Somebody who's got 20 years to retirement might have a much different type of risk profile and therefore investment profile than somebody who's only 6 years away from retirement. Making sure that employees are educated on those expense loads, or potentially referred to as asset management fees, are a critical part of the education process. And helping employees find other outside independent investment resources so that they can educate themselves to become appropriately astute investors in their 401k is an important part of this overall employee education process. The next topic is correcting errors. This can get pretty complicated because you're actually going to be dealing with both the Department of Labor and the IRS. Some of the things that happen with plans is you might not have updated your plan to be in compliance with current language. Possibly you didn't base the operations of your plan according to the way your plan's written. It's important to make sure you understand how your plan's written and then follow those written instructions. If you want to deviate from that, make sure your plan is appropriately amended for any deviations. Possibly you didn't define compensation correctly when identifying what the percentage of contributions should be based on, or what the matching contribution should be on, or possibly even with the discrimination tests. Employer matching contributions weren't made appropriately to all employees. Possibly your plan has failed the actual deferral percentage or the actual contribution percentage tests, and you haven't made corrections in a timely manner. It's possible that eligible employees weren't given an appropriate opportunity to make their election deferrals. In other words, potentially you've excluded some people who should be involved in or have been allowed to enroll in your 401k plan. Elective deferrals weren't limited to the amounts that are required under the IRS rules. And possibly for one reason or another, maybe somebody is on vacation in the payroll department, but monies were deducted from payroll but not appropriately contributed to the 401k plan, in other words, invested appropriately in a timely manner. Possibly your participant loans weren't administered according to the IRS rules. Maybe hardship withdrawals were allowed and, again, not appropriately documented. Maybe the plan was top-heavy and the appropriate contributions from the employer weren't made to the plan to correct for that top-heavy status. And possibly you've just missed up and haven't filed your 5500 in a timely manner. Any of these issues can cause some problems. We'll talk about what the IRS and Department of Labor do to allow for those corrections, but it's important that employers who have 401ks take all of these issues seriously, and by no means is this an exhaustive list of all the responsibilities of a plan sponsor, but this is 12 of the more common ones. But the consequences of having your plan disallowed are very significant. It means reclassifying a lot of contributions that employees have made when they've done their taxes. Potentially multiple years worth of past taxes might have to be called into question, and audits could be performed on employees who don't take the time to refile past tax returns because of these reclassifications. Bottom line is you do not want a plan, a 401k plan, that's been disallowed or disqualified. In terms of correcting the errors, again, you're going to be dealing with the IRS and the Department of Labor for certain circumstances. The Department of Labor has two programs: the Delinquent Filer Voluntary Compliance Program, so-called DFVCP, and then unfortunately a very similar acronym for the Voluntary Fiduciary Correction Program, referred to as the VFCP. The IRS has its own acronym for its Employee Plans Compliance Resolution System, also known as the EPCRS. This chart will help explain the type of program that, or the type of error that you may find yourself with, and what type of application needs to be made into which of those 3 different programs, 2 handled by the Department of Labor and 1 handled by the IRS. Bottom line is you will definitely want some expert legal assistance, tax assistance, if you think your plan is out of compliance. And the sooner you jump on that compliance issue and get it corrected, the better off you will be. It's important that you don't risk that plan disqualification for mismanagement of how 401ks need to operate. This concludes our video number 8 on 401k plans. Thank you for sharing this last hour with me, and hopefully has given you a good solid understanding of how 401ks operate, and more importantly, whether or not they are appropriate for your business as an alternative to the CalSavers program.